Great. Thank you again, everybody, for being here. Welcome back to Ethically Speaking. Today we're scheduled, so the series, for those of you who aren't familiar with it yet, or very well, the last year or so, we've built the series around informal discussions that are sort of turning around these little podcasts that we've identified. So we have podcasts up. We listen to those or use those to sort of start our thinking. So this week we're focused on, the topic was facial recognition, AI, and you. And for those of you who know me, you know that I've got kind of a dark view of the future of information technologies. And so you should all grain of salt that, of course, but I tend to be attracted to the sort of podcasts that are like, information technologies are going to destroy our lives, right? And that's just one angle of the argument. This one is pretty balanced, actually. So the title of it doesn't make it sound that way. So the title is How AI is Destroying Our Moral and Civic Efficacy. Dark. But I think Elizabeth Adams, who's interviewed in the podcast, does a really good job of sort of saying there's good potential, but not yet. That's the argument from the podcast, is that we've got all this great potential for facial recognition technologies to decrease harms and increase efficacy. Those are her two central arguments, but not right now. And that's really what I wanted to talk through. Like, where are we with facial recognition technologies? What does that look like? And where does the future take us? Just to give you a little bit of framing, Steve, Dr. Kubler and I talked last week just a little bit about robots and ethics. So last week we'd focused on a topic I'd called the rise of the robots. And there were questions about the ways in which robots could or should replace human beings in different technologies, different contexts. So a lot of the questions are the same, right? Can robots increase human efficiency? Can they increase human efficacy? And so we talked about lots of different examples there, including the podcast mentioned robot therapy cats. So there are robots that are being used in therapy contexts, basically to keep people company, older people who might be alone a lot, or dementia patients who might not have those human contacts or not be able to cultivate them well. And interacting with robots does decrease stress. I mean, this is sort of data-driven science at this point. And so robots play this really important claim, but what are the limitations, right? Robots now organize our groceries, tell us what kind of things we should and shouldn't buy. They keep us company in some regards. They entertain us. They might deliver things for us. They fly our airplanes. I mean, the robots topic is huge. And so what we try to do this week is narrow that to say, okay, we talked broadly about robots, but here's this one information technology, facial recognition. What's going on there? And one of the things that Elizabeth, the podcast interviewee, said right at the beginning was that lots of people use facial recognition already to, say, unlock their devices. I would wager that's probably not true of many folks in this crowd, but does anybody use their thumbprint or their facial ID to unlock their phone? Yeah.
I use my thumbprint, but it's useless because my kids know my password on my phone anyway. So.
Well, I will report to you all that I just got my very first smartphone, which is this adorable little thing. I've never had this an Android phone. I've never had a smartphone before. A year ago, I gave up my phone.
I am so disappointed.
I know, Sterling.
I've been holding out. You've been a Luddite hero. My God.
I know, Sterling. I'm with you there.
Yeah, well, I will say, Sterling, to
the world coming to when you.
Yeah, to defend myself, right? I've never once turned on location services, and I unlock with a passcode. Not a swipe and not a facial recognition. But it is interesting because the other thing that I'm realizing, and you all are probably realizing now coming up to tax season, is that if you want to access irs.gov anymore, you need to use facial recognition. And that's not, you don't need to, but that's the primary mode of unlocking your account. You upload a scan of your driver's license to IRS, and then you log in using your face. That's not the only way. You can still call on the phone and get work done that way. But if you want to use the web portal, facial recognition is the way it is. So even the federal government has taken up facial rec in this really important way. Now, this is all riding on the back of this podcast, which, again, the argument is we're not ready for that, right? There's too many ethical issues going on. So that's one of the things I wanted to sort of talk with you all about, like what are the ethical concerns around facial recognition. And then the other thing, just a couple of things I want to talk about. She focuses a lot on the interviewee focuses a lot on questions of equity and social justice. And then I also wanted to talk about the role of expertise a little bit, because she defines herself as a technologist, which is a new professional domain for me. I hadn't really heard of anybody described as a technologist before. So I want to talk about expertise and then ethical issues. Okay, enough for me.
Can I just throw this out there? Because I'm going to have to leave early. So prior to coming to UCF, I had an opportunity to work with BEMA, and that stands for the Biometric Identity Management Agency of the military. And we got into several conversations, one of which about the training of these biometric model, software, whatever. And one of the concerns is that it's usually trained on white people, white men. And so while the accuracy may be okay, it doesn't take into consideration different people of different colors, different shades, different lighting. And then I remember that, you know, they tried to say, okay, well, we're not going to worry about like the overarching feature, but kind of turn it into an architectural design of the face, and then use that as a way to measure. But I don't know if that has gained any traction. But again, you know, all of this still comes down to who is the population that it's being trained off of, and will it leave certain populations at a disadvantage, taking into consideration the other disadvantage of access to computers and cameras and internet. Like that's another piece in and of itself. But I guess that would be where I don't know. Does anyone know any information about that? But that's where my question is.
I don't know much information, but I prepared for this little talk today, and I had a really interesting article. I know what's the American Scientist isn't like a super peer-reviewed journal or anything, but the dark past of algorithms that associate appearance and criminality. And just what you said, and China is really bad about this. China's is setting up cameras apparently, and I've got this, I could forward this article to anybody. China sets up cameras and they're taking photographs of marginalized populations and setting up a criminal consortium of what that would look like. So they're actively putting people in a racial category and looking at facial features and going off of that. But yeah, the article said that it was like 90%, over 90% inaccurate based on whether the photo's taken looking down, looking up, how much lighting there is, and actually, well, it says they have a gaydar algorithm. So based on whether your expression or how much light's on your face, they put you in a homosexual category, or, you know, and they're looking at criminality, the slope of the forehead, and all that. And it's an international type, it's had international exposure, but China's really developing it hard. Yeah.
Yeah, Sterling, I've heard, I mean, I don't know a lot of details, but it's also part of the social credit system that China has developed. So yeah, it's interesting. You mentioned in the chat phrenology, which has the sort of dark eugenics past in the US, but the study of personality type based on physical structure is a part of the eugenics going way, way back. Very old idea, largely discredited. But the idea that, I've read similar studies, Sterling, that facial recognition is being used not only for faces, but also for phrenology type, but also for movement based on gait or stance.
Yes.
Yep. So we're using
micro expressions. Yeah. Facial movement, eyebrow twitches, and the likes. Yeah.
And then there's pushback. I remember when a colleague of mine at Penn State had worked for the federal government intelligence for a little while, and she had cued me into the idea that there's a sort of pushback. People are using technology, and this was done in Hong Kong during protests, but you can develop masks of different types to bypass algorithmic identification, right? So masks that are light reflective or disrupt the whatever sensing is going on. Yeah, and then Candace, the one thing from what you said in the podcast I found really interesting was that the interviewee had mentioned a study that was done of an infrared light study done of people of different backgrounds taking temperatures with an infrared sensor. And so the algorithm, she reported, and I don't have any data here, this is just from the podcast, but she reported that a white person holding an infrared thermometer to their forehead, the algorithm read them as 88% most likely holding some kind of handheld tech. But if it was a black person holding the same device doing the same thing, the algorithm read it as 66% likely holding a gun, a firearm. So there's a great example of an algorithm that is just based on the type of data it was trained on is making these incredibly biased decisions. And this was made really famous, or at least in the US, some dissertation work in 2016 or so became a book in 2018 called Algorithms of Oppression. Sophia Noble wrote that book out of her dissertation research, and she's gotten a lot of sort of press and publicity because she made this very explicit, this idea that algorithms are biased based on the data that they're trained on. And there's almost no way around that. So one of the things I wanted to juxtapose this afternoon with you all is that question of bias, which is like based on training input, and the view taken by Clearview technology, which was mentioned in the podcast and is deployed in Volusia County here and is being deployed in Seminole County now. So Clearview has taken this really interesting approach, and they've been like, okay, we get it, right? Algorithms tend to be biased because they have a limited training input. So what Clearview has done is scraped everything they can get their hands on. Social media data, anything publicly available, they've just scraped it, and they're building this massive facial recognition training protocol that's being used all over the country and here in the state too. So Clearview has this approach where they've just been taking everything because they're going to train on the biggest data set they can. And it's a problem because in 2020 or late 2020, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter all wrote to Clearview and said, stop scraping our data. Right? So they think that those big tech companies think there's an issue. There's probably an issue. Right? So you've got sort of two sides of this coin. One is the just sort of massive, unabated, unregulated collection of data. That's Clearview. And one is the training on too small a data set, which leads to bias, which is on the other side. And I think that landscape is really interesting because there's the argument of the podcast is, well, in the future, we'll find some happy pastoral middle ground that will cultivate fruitfully, and all of a sudden we'll be better, happier, more efficient people. And again, you can read my little dark undertones there because I don't think that's going to happen, right? I think we're all in big data, or we're not at all in big data, and it's an on or off sort of thing. But
yeah,
again,
I was gonna. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Camille. Yeah.
I was gonna say it kind of always, like, for me from an IRB side, I think of it as like history shows that like they always develop things or research is done on very specific populations, even especially in like biomedical research or with new drugs and devices and how vulnerable populations are not represented. But I was thinking about what you were just saying and how it always seems to happen at the end. And this is my dark moment and undertone is it's always when something bad happens that everyone's like, they never like look at it prior, like, okay, what do we need to implement and do to not have this happen? It's always at the end after something insane happens, and then they don't want the technology at all. It's like, oh, this is useless, look what happened, instead of how do we implement these things from the beginning to make this useful and to make sure that, like what she said, purposeful AI, bringing the community in. It's just, yeah, it's interesting because I think that she has a point about saying like, yeah, it needs to be more diverse from the jump. But I do think, I think about like Facebook and Instagram and how things have happened. And then now we're like, okay, what's the oversight? And there's still kind of no oversight. So when these things are put into place, thinking of it from start to end, like, so once this is used and consistently, how are we making sure that there's actual oversight, and making sure that this oversight isn't another company with a bias? Like, I think right now it's like Apple is watching over things with Facebook. I'm like, I'm not really sure how much I trust that either. Like, it's like, how do you make sure that you have oversight that's going to actually hold them accountable? And then with the not military, but with like police officers, like at the end of the day, it's still a person, you know, using this technology. So how are you making sure that the person also understands the limitations of the technology? So yeah, there's just a lot of things there. I'm like, it just scares me because I just think it's putting almost more reassurance on someone who doesn't really understand or who already has a bias in a community that needs to be trained more for that specific population. So I think of it as like, now someone feels even more comfortable making a call with less information where they're thinking that they have more.
Yeah, Camille, that question of like where responsibility lies bugs us. Steve, you and I were just talking about this yesterday, right? That like, does it lie with the tech companies, Camille, in your example, or does it lie with federal regulators, or does it lie with the consumer? Like, where does it fall to somebody to only consume what's right or only put out what's right? And yeah, I mean, I've got a very one-sided argument that I want to offer, but I'm trying to find like, is there a middle ground? Because that's what the argument of the podcast is. Like, that's the goal, is to find some sort of like way in which these, whether it's facial rec or any other big tech, big data technology, can help us live, on her words, more efficiently.
I mean, if we've learned anything from the movie Minority Report, no, the answer is always no. Because if everyone has the right to consume the information that they want to consume and that they want to believe is right? So, and there's no way to convince everybody to be of the same mindset on every topic. So save just taking a portion of the population and not allowing them to live life so they can just see, you know, right or not right. We're always putting every technology, every software in the hands of humans, and humans are inherently self-serving decision makers.
Yeah. Stephen, I see your hand.
Yeah, as far as accuracy for the use of this kind of technology, I think that corporations understand what's going on here. For example, both Samsung and Apple have new phones with new cameras that are much more accurate when displaying darker skin tones. I think that is going to make a difference. The other thing, I think, consider how polygraphs, lie detectors, are used in court. They're not used in court. In fact, they're used maybe during the process of trying to, you know, maybe find a suspect, but they can't be used to actually convict someone. And so until, you know, this type of technology gets even better and more accurate, and more ethical protocols are out, more training, perhaps it ought to be treated sort of like polygraphs, you know, in courts, where it can't be used as a final determinant on identifying a person or guilt.
Yeah, that's interesting, Stephen. So there's a police chief in Volusia County who, Mike Chitwood is his name, who actually came down from my home state in Maine to work in Florida. And Chitwood has been really vocal about the role of the police in Florida. And he has talked about this, about facial recognition. He said the exact same thing, that state policies and Volusia County policies lean heavily on reasonable suspicion, and that those technologies can only be deployed under conditions of reasonable suspicion. But again, like there's the slipperiness there, right? Like, you know, we put in those constraints, and it's the same with lie detectors. We can use them or misuse them, and it depends on functionally the moral orientation of the person using them, and the biases and the pressures and all of those things. The difference, though, is that like old school lie detector tests, like you had to connect to the paper polygraph and it would give an output and you'd have a paper record. And this is not that, right? This is like, if a police officer stops me and decides that they have reasonable suspicion to enter me into the Clearview database, or in a more refined version here in Florida is the FACES database, which I had to look this up, but it stands for Face Analysis Comparison and Examination System. And it compares mugshots with driver's licenses. So right now, I assume I'm not in that database, but if I were stopped and a police officer had reasonable suspicion, they could upload my driver's license. And I assure you and all of our listeners at home, they won't find me in a mugshot yet, but the idea is that my face would be like in that database forever, right? I have no recourse to get it out. Once it's there, it's there. And it's different than a paper polygraph, which might be filed in a drawer somewhere. And that like big data concern really bothers me a lot.
Jonathan, I wonder if there's other ways to end up in the database. You know, I'm highly active in scouting, and so scouting does background checks on people. So when you voluntarily subscribe to background checks and things like that, all with great intentions, I wonder how much you're automatically put into those kinds of databases. Which, you know, at one level I think is just fine, but you know, when things go south, it's not fine, you know. So.
Well,
Just be a good scout.
Yeah, well, to Candace's point, right? Imagine if two versions of Dr. Kubler, like a black version and a white version. I would imagine the two versions of Dr. Kubler have very different orientations to whether they're comfortable ending up in that database. Because white Dr. Kubler, if you get pulled over by the police, like the likelihood of the police assuming algorithmically or not that you have a weapon and might be at risk is much lower than the black version of Dr. Kubler. And so if I were a black participant in scouting, I would think like, I would be much less comfortable with being included in a database. And I'm already very uncomfortable being included in a database. Yeah, so those biases they're like exacerbated by big data, facial recognition technologies, but they exist all the way down the chain.
But how much different is it from having a witness in court trying to identify a suspect? I mean, how accurate is that? And another one is DNA databases, by the way, which have often been used to narrow down a selection of a particular suspect. So,
yeah, yeah. I mean, this is true. Again, we focus on rather arbitrarily facial recognition technologies, but yeah, Stephen, you're right that we could be talking about DNA technologies. My undergraduates always hear from me the story of the Golden State Killer and how the Golden State Killer out in California was discovered and identified and eventually arrested. And that was DNA on a styrofoam cup, right? And some like weird circuitous accidental data sharing that the police figured out. But that's a really intriguing case.
And even then they didn't narrow it down to the individual. They got it down to a family of people. And then by other data, they were able to find out, you know, who the likely suspect was. So,
yes, absolutely.
Similar. Yeah.
Candace, go ahead.
To that point, there's two aspects of DNA screening or interpretation. One is the phenotype that they've been trying to get to. So if I have an unknown sample, don't know anything about it, I could identify phenotypic information along with potential genetic classes and start looking for someone. But that's inherently problematic, primarily because all of the phenotypic information are things that can be changed. Eye colors can be changed with contacts. Hair color can be changed with shaving your head. Facial hair, like, you know, outside of skin color, unless you do bleaching or whatever, outside of that, everything can be changed. So now you're looking for a white man, blonde hair, blue eyes, who doesn't have blonde hair or blue eyes.
Yeah.
You know, and the other aspect about like the Golden State Killer, that's another area that has been discussed in the DNA realm of unintentional biases. The fact that we can do familial searching is inherently biased towards the rich and the white, particularly because those are the ones that have disposable income enough to submit for a DNA analysis to begin with. So the databases that are allowed, or the databases that are in a position to be searched, are going to be more of the rich and more of the white population. So now you've unintentionally biased it in that direction as well. And at the end of the day, all of this comes down to trust. And there are many communities that do not trust the government for widely various reasons. And some of it goes back to Camille's discussion of the IRB. So, you know, the syphilis studies, the prisoner research, the, you know, Hitler stuff, right? So all of those lead to a fundamental distrust. And what are they going to do with my information? It's yeah.
Yep. And you could, that list is so ridiculously long, Candace, too, right? You could add Henrietta Lack's story, you could add the Guatemala STD studies, you could add Wellbrook. Yeah, I mean, you could go on and on and on, just in the US. I mean, it's remarkable. Yeah, so the reason for distrust is real. And that's such a narrow context, because that's distrust of like federally sponsored research, functionally, right? You go beyond that and it just gets much, much bigger, much, much more quickly. Yeah, I keep thinking back to that question of responsibility. Like, so I feel like we're all kind of circling around the same argument that there are these inherent problems in, let's stick with facial recognition technologies. But Candace, you mentioned a Minority Report, and like, that's where my head goes too, like the dark side. And I always try to think in fiction and film, are there positive examples? And it's really weird actually, because my go-to for a positive case is Stark Industries in the Marvel universe, right? You've got Tony Stark, Iron Man, who has access to information. That's his superpower, right? Well, that and money, I guess, right? Money and information, all one big bucket. And that's the only reason he's a superhero. And he has this weird character arc where like he has like a like a Mark Zuckerberg moment where he's like rich and powerful and chauvinistic, and then he like realizes that his power can destroy as well as create, and he has this like reckoning, and then all of a sudden he's a superhero. And I like the optimistic narrative there. Like, yeah, it's cool. The Zuckerbergs will just come around, and like Facebook will recognize that their force is more destructive than creative, and they'll do something about it. But again, I have that Camille's foot in the dark pond. I just don't think that's the case. And I wonder what you all think about the sort of self-regulation that seems to be the landscape we live in right now.
I think one of the issues is, when is it appropriate to use it? I know you want to stick to facial recognition, but it reminds me of an article I read about a handheld polygraph that was used in Iraq. And it was only 80% accurate, but it's where you have to make an instant decision on whether this person is lying or not. Is he enemy, or is he, you know, one of us, one of the good guys? And yet they used it. That's all they had. You know, this, and so the same thing is, you know, if you stop a car and you have an image of this person, does he fit a database? When is it appropriate to use that? It's probably not appropriate necessarily to handcuff the guy and haul him away right off the bat, but you might want to take down his identifying information to use later on after it's more thoroughly checked out. But yeah, so when is it appropriate to use that type of thing?
Yeah, Stephen, there's like a tipping point problem you're describing too, because I can imagine, like, I'm sure this hasn't ever been studied, but, or couldn't be studied, but imagine that the average American soldier was like 60% effective, which would be remarkable, but 60% effective, whether telling a possible combatant was lying or telling the truth. And then you introduce a tech that is 80% effective. Well, that's better than 60%. So shouldn't you rely on that tech rather than the soldier? Like, but there's got to be some point at which, like, okay, now it's 97% effective. And like, okay, now we can use it, right? even then, like I'm still unsure. Like we're relying on technologies to make decisions. There's no need to stay constrained to facial recognition, because at the university right now, we're having good discussions about student data and predictive analytics, the idea that we're using data about student success in courses to sort of identify students who might be at risk in particular disciplines or particular courses. And that's all based on nothing about the individual, but about statistical data. And that seems...
I don't know. I was pretty impressed when they actually used it to, first of all, take the license tag numbers of people that were in and out of the parking garages, and they used it finally. And I don't know if facial recognition was used or not, but they identified a person who was bothering women in restrooms, and they arrested him, right? I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. I don't remember the details. That was pretty interesting. So I don't know how far that went, but I'm kind of glad they got him. I mean, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's all kinds of cases like that. And it's true that like, but on the other side of that coin is like, there's no opportunity to opt in or opt out of LPR, license plate recognition technologies. It just was rolled out, right? And it's not managed by, it doesn't go through Camille. It doesn't go through Camille's office or anybody focused on ethical use of data. It's law enforcement and the corporate end of parking services.
It does make me, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, Camille, please.
I was like, it does make me think of like the GDPR regulations, like overseas, and like how there's like that move to the right to your data and when it can be used and when it can be removed. I'm not sure that might be very specific to research, but I wonder if that's going to be implemented across the board with someone's personal data. I do wonder if that will switch once it's something that like a government requires, like, oh, we need your face so that we can, this is a requirement as being a citizen. Going back to what you're saying about the responsibility, I was listening to a podcast and they were kind of honing in on Facebook. And they were saying like, well, that certain companies, like once they create it, is it really the company's job, their responsibility, or someone else? How well can they actually regulate themselves? And then especially if the company themselves feels like a target, they feel like they're, actually doing this amazing thing and everyone else is targeting them. So I think it's like a combination of like companies from the jump having a responsibility, like an ethical responsibility. And I think we also saw this like Spotify, the Joe Rogan podcast of like, is it his responsibility or is it Spotify's? Is this a question of like how we feel that Spotify should have some kind of ethical bound? Like where does the line get drawn of like freedom of speech? Or so it's weird. It's like this weird, like I feel like it's a balance of like the responsibility of the company, but also regulations, knowing that there's a limit to where that can, like a combo. And then just one thing I wanted to jump on was that at the end of that podcast we listened to, she mentioned about with the doll, the Barbie, the Hello Barbie or something like that. And it was an interesting take because I wasn't sure where she was going with that. But then when she said, the people listening in, like their feelings, like if they hear this, like how do you deal with that? And that's something I would think of like whenever I'm thinking about research and someone shares something, even if it's anonymous research, and they share something like I'm suicidal and I feel this every single day, like what's your responsibility as a researcher? What's your responsibility for reporting? Like depending on your role, if it's anonymous, like if you're going to be asking these questions, should they be anonymous? Should they not? Should there be, so it was just an interesting thing she added at the end that I thought about a lot of, like the responsibility of the person receiving that information. And then with big companies, they're not looking at the effect of maybe some of the people that are analyzing that data. So just seeing it on their side too, because you see a lot of people that work in these big companies and finally leave and they're like, they feel like they can breathe again. They're like, oh, I knew something, here was morally wrong, but I couldn't say anything. So I think about those effects in the long run too.
Yeah, Camille, that resonates because I think about all the people who have worked for Facebook doing content. I don't know what the technical term is, but looking at content and deciding whether it can stay or go, right? Those people have really impressively high stress jobs because they're looking at sometimes awful content all day long and having to make those decisions. So there's like psychological implications, even on just personally. That's not even about like the person who's information it is and their responsibilities to them. Yeah. Yeah, the Hello Barbie doll, the Hello Barbie example was really interesting. I don't think I'd known about that because it's not particularly that old, but yeah, there's some really great pieces. I'll put a couple in the chat. There's a couple of pieces, an article called, which I thought the title was great, Hello Barbie's Just Insecure, that was written back in 2015 when data security flaws were just identified. And that's what the research is talking about. And then in 2017, when Barbie discontinued that Barbie doll, the Hello Barbie website has a really interesting and very clear privacy commitment statement that you can read in the chat here, which basically says, we don't use your data. You can shut it off at any time. It doesn't record just willy-nilly. I mean, it's very explicit about what's happening. And that privacy commitment is different than the privacy policy at Mattel or Barbie's company writ large. So yeah, that landscape is really interesting, but I guess I hadn't thought, Camille, about the responsibility of the person listening, which is what the podcaster is focused on. Like if a kid says, I'm being hurt or I'm hungry, I think were the two examples. Like, you know, there's nothing to do about that. You're just listening to these conversations. The other thing that had been on my mind in this podcast was the idea of expertise, right? Because we've come together, this group, those of us here right now come from all different disciplinary backgrounds. And this podcaster was identifying, is a sort of a CEO, does some consulting work, but identifies as a technologist. And I found that really interesting because I'm not sure what that means necessarily. Like, I guess technologists are those people who work on technology, but those could be the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world on the like pro side, or they could be the Elizabeth Adams, the interviewee, on the sort of con side. But that's a pretty wide gamut of folks. And it makes me wonder, like, what's the role of, say, the ethicist, or the role of the engineer, or the role of the social scientists in arbitrating what's going on? And this has been on my mind because Dr. Kubler and I have been having a conversation with one of our colleagues, faculty colleagues, who've sort of been talking about questions of like when and where do ethicists step in, and what role, what expertise do they bring to specific problems.
One of the things that strikes me is that the answers of what should be done or what could be done vary widely across states and the countries. You know, maybe all of us here, or most of us, are thinking about a US perspective, but the social and political structure and legal structure in the US is so different from that of other countries. So I would hazard a guess, you can refute it if you like, but I would hazard a guess that probably most restrictions come not because, to Camille's point, because of forward thinking on the part of companies. How should we roll out this technology? And I don't think it necessarily comes from regulation. I think it mostly comes from the courts, and then regulation probably follows. Some company does not prognosticate the impacts of their technology, and then a lawsuit follows, right? And then we back engineer out our society and come up with, promulgate all of the policies or rules that we need in order to have, you know, to right wrongs. And so it's kind of reverse engineering then the social justice issues. And so now just thinking about the US, I don't know if we'll ever really be in a different place. You know, this is not a country that says, yeah, let's regulate logically and thoughtfully. We don't do regulation in this country. And it takes years and years and years before some levels of regulation become acceptable. If you think back to the 70s, Los Angeles was always covered with a yellow sky because of smog. Then we regulated coal-fired plants, put on control stacks, and that helped a lot, you know, raised gas mileage, required catalytic converters. Suddenly the skies over Los Angeles are clear, but people don't look to those regulations as the solution. Now we're back in an era where people are saying, no, we need to deregulate more. It's killing the economy. But in fact, it's what allows us to breathe if you live in Los Angeles and a lot of other places. We're not a society that says, yeah, let's go regulate. We are a society that says, let's go litigate. And so I wonder if ultimately the responsibility does not have to be with the ethicist or the technologist or whomever, but with the justice, who basically decides once a harm is done that, yeah, the company is responsible. And if in fact we had legislation that didn't try to regulate and say, when you roll out your AI technology, you need to have these controls. If instead we had legislation that says, if your AI technology fails, company, you're responsible, and so too are shareholders and CEOs. I wonder if that would work better in this country and maybe quickly accelerate a conversation involving broader stakeholders than just people who are concerned about having their picture in a database.
That's so interesting, because that kind of circles back to the, like, we have to wait till something bad happens and then regulate or litigate. I guess on your thinking, litigate and then eventually regulate down the road. But there might be a bad thing that happens, years of a court battle until something happens, and then eventually regulation. So there might be a huge disconnect from. Yeah, that's super interesting.
Well, yeah, yes and no. What I said is we've been down this path many, many times. And so maybe the way in this country to get ahead of it is to say, here are the issues, but now the responsibility clearly lies with companies. You know, we've already passed laws that say if someone becomes ill because of COVID, they can't sue their company because of, you know, policies on wearing masks or not, or being, you know, immunized or not. That ship sailed. Why not sail it in the other direction and have legislation before the accident or before the problem that says, if a problem emerges, a false accusation, a social harm due to AI, then the company is responsible. So just put it out there so that people understand and companies understand what the implications of their technology could be.
But how would that work in something like law enforcement? You know, that may be a little too steep a hill to climb, I think.
Why? Because law enforcement uses privately supplied and engineered devices all of the time.
They do. I guess it would go back to how is it used. If it's used to investigate, that's one thing. If it's used to convict, that's something else. You know, just like the lie detector.
It still goes back to the company. If a company sells a product, not understanding that the end user is fully informed that this cannot be the only way to do a conviction, then they remain liable. You know, in the same way that a doctor has to provide alternative treatments, the company has a responsibility to inform law enforcement or any of their clients about the right and wrong way to use a product.
So but wouldn't it be benefit versus harm? In other words, don't you want some kind of would you throw the baby out with the bathwater if there's some benefit in using it? You know, a killer loose on the street or whatever is pretty bad news. And
well, they're not mutually exclusive, and our perception of the relative benefit versus harm depends upon who received the benefit and who received the harm. The person has the false accusation. To Dr. Jonathan Bieber's point, the black Kubler sees much greater harm than the person who sees, you know, the accusations and sees them as beneficial. So I think it's different. It's difficult to measure, but it's maybe pivoting the conversation away from an all or nothing sense that the technology has to be so robust that it's used 100%, and more toward a vision of what is the company's responsibility in rolling out a technology, provide clear, informed consent about how it should be used, and making sure it's used in concert with other structures where ultimately there are multiple layers of decision making, including people. So maybe a technology is used to winnow down a field of suspects, but not necessarily to make an immediate action. And with regard to military applications, I think it's terrible if we're going to use AI to immediately pull a trigger.
Yeah, I agree. To Camille's point, Camille, you said that like maybe it's the fear of the responsibility will make companies more proactive. I was trying to think about that.
I hate using the word fear because I just think of like a religion, but like with that idea of like I don't, he's watching, but I would think of it more of like the knowing that it's your responsibility. Maybe you think about it going into it a different way, whereas like I'm going to do this and then I know I'll get away with it depending on how much money I have from this. It's always like after the fact, or like we'll get enough people involved that we can push the responsibility elsewhere. Like having that clear idea of where the responsibility lies if something were to happen definitely would make people think twice about how to make sure or mitigate any possible risks. But
yeah, maybe it's not fear, maybe it's like
Risk.
liability or risk.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
There's got to be a good analogy with the Ford Pinto problem, and basically the courts decided they should not have, run the numbers and decided how many people can die before you do a recall.
Yeah, I was trying to think about a facial recognition example. So I'll think again about Clearview, the company that does all that massive data scraping that Florida law enforcement is starting to use. So I'm trying to imagine a world in which like the Dr. Kubler's model is up and running, so that there's legislation up in place that says, look, if a Seminole County law enforcement official uses Clearview's facial recognition database inappropriately or unethically, right? It's the liability of Clearview, maybe, and the officer, and or I don't know, but like Clearview is involved in that. I wonder if that were like a federal level policy, if that would have slowed down Clearview's rollout, right? If they would have, or if it would have been, if it just would have been another layer of legalese where Clearview would have a policy that, a training protocol that all police officers have to go through, and then they'd have to sign a waiver that says, like, we've trained you, we told you here are the risks, and like now it's on you, right? Like there's probably a bit of like legal can kicking that would go on up and down the road. I'm mixing metaphors here terribly, but it would be interesting because that would at least make those big companies think like, okay, what are the implications, legal implications, I guess in this case, of developing in the way we're developing, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then there's a third level. So like if Clearview is liable, they might also say, yeah, but our data comes from Facebook and Twitter and Instagram. Like
Exactly.
they're also liable. And like Facebook would say, yeah, but our data comes from the end user. And like, so like legal liability or culpability, maybe it's culpability, like extends through the entire information spectrum, which comes right back around to the end user again. Again, I don't know. I feel like I'm arguing a very aggressively negative side of the argument here. So sorry about that.
Does anybody know, are these technologies ever rolled out through public-private partnership where, it's not just companies generate a tech and then it's used in the public sector by law enforcement? Are there any situations where maybe they're developed, through a thoughtful partnership so that some of these ethical issues are addressed?
That's a good question.
Well, I remember a few years back, and you all might remember better than I do, but when I first got to UCF back in 2015, 2016, that was just when the police and parking services were starting to develop LPR technologies, license plate recognition. And I remember the police chief doing what I thought was a very thoughtful, here are the boundaries of this technology, here's where that information is stored. It seemed to be pretty transparent, like here are the ways in which it's going to be used, here's who has access to it, under what conditions. The police side of that LPR rollout I thought was really thoughtful. It was also coupled though to this other side of the collection, which was through parking services, and they had nothing like that sort of transparent rollout. But that might be a kind of an example, maybe, Steve, of like at least like a public entity coupled with a private entity, all coupled to UCF, trying to roll out this big data technology, which, to Stephen's point, like has caught criminals, I guess, and like caused me to grumble every time I can't back into a parking spot. But there's all kinds of like other issues. Yeah.
I'm trying to think of how you might more broadly interpret that, and I'm thinking, even though it's not facial recognition, of the lawsuit against Remington by the single state that actually had a law holding the corporation responsible with a huge fine that they had to pay, but it was only in that one state, and that's the reason. Maybe you remember it better than I do. And I'm thinking of the bartender that serves alcohol too. I mean, the same sort of thing. Sometimes bartenders or even private citizens in their own home are held responsible if someone goes out and injures themselves or someone else. So how would that kind of thinking fit in with what you're talking about? How would you make it practical? How would you narrow it down and identify who the guilty party is? It seems to me there's a lot of loose ends there.
Those are interesting parallels and things that I hadn't thought about. And I enjoyed putting out my question about whether proactive legislation that says companies are responsible. It was offered in as a proposal and not as a 100% thought out conclusion, obviously. But I think it gets us thinking about a number of things, that culpability is almost never 0 or 100%. I mean, in most legal cases where there's some sort of tort and some sort of harm, it's almost always done as a split culpability. Even if you walk out in front of a car and you're hit by a car as a pedestrian, well, you should have looked, well, the car should have been going slow enough, and there's some assignment of duty. So I think one of the problems that we get into is where we think in binary terms, but I think thinking in binary terms like that is very useful and important. Otherwise it gets too wishy-washy. So there's a useful tension there, even in thinking about the problem.
Yeah, the same with driverless cars, another AI technology for sure. And I know in some court systems, they have a percentage with each person or each individual. This person was culpable percentage, this percentage, and this one was this percentage. Maybe it can be resolved somehow like that. I don't know.
To add one more level to the argument, we've kind of it's interesting because I think we've made some assumptions to get us to where we've ended up so far. So here's what we might call a cat out of the bag argument, right? So the conversation around who's responsible for the implications of technology assumes that we should have developed the technology in the first place, right? So the cat out of the bag argument is, what's the responsibility of, say, the researcher, like university researchers, in developing those technologies? Where should the researcher say, no, I can imagine a world in which my technology, facial recognition technology, is going to get picked up and used in these awful ways, and I can't foresee any possibility of stopping that once it's out of the bag, therefore I'm just going to stop the research.
Actually, I just thought of another good example, which is pharmaceuticals. They're advertised on television. This may solve your particular medical issue, but it can also do this harm and this harm and this harm. And so, they put it out there, and then it's up to the individual and their doctor to assess the risk.
Well, that's true, Stephen, but that's already making the assumption that technology's been approved at all these various federal regulatory levels and institutional levels. Like, the harm and benefit analysis is not up to the consumer, really. It's up to the regulator. Once the technology is on the market, yeah, there's legal reasons why the company has to say, take this drug, it's going to solve erectile dysfunction but give you flatulence or whatever it is, right? Like some combination of medical things. But
no, it is up to the consumer to a point. If they tell you don't take more than one pill and the person takes 10, then they're culpable to a certain degree as well. It's a misuse of a clear explanation, and
or this is
clearly stated on the,
not for curing COVID in people, whatever. Yeah.
I was going to say to that point that you were just saying about, man, I just blanked completely. You just said it, Dr. Beaver, completely blanked. Oh yeah, so about research, I was thinking because it kind of seems like we tend to go with, if we're not making it, someone else is making it. So we need to make it first. And it's always I don't want to be, I don't know, for me, the mentality tends to be, at least in the US, is we got to come up with it first, the fastest and the best or the quickest. And if we don't do it, regardless of maybe some of the ethical reasons, or there's actually no benefit to society, so you just want to show that you can make it. If you don't do it, someone else will. So at least if you make it, some of the ramifications or what you need to do. It's almost like you build a technology to then build something to take that technology down. So it just seems like such a weird, it definitely seems like we tend to do stuff with the idea to make sure that someone else doesn't do it first, instead of is there actual benefit to it? And so I think especially in this podcast, she definitely talked about why at the end, why are we building this technology, thinking about how it actually benefits society and the community. I think that happens a lot less often than not. And maybe that would help, but I don't see that changing.
Well, yeah, and maybe that seems really well said, Camille. This dates back to the development of the atomic bomb, and even further. Like we've always sort of developed technologies and then had these like, oh crap moments. So maybe there's a flavor being built in here of technological determinism. So one idea of technological determinism is that the technologies sort of determine the social implications. But maybe what they're determining is just future regulation. Like maybe every time a technology is built, we're going to assume eventually we're going to regulate its negative implications. And we're assuming that in the end, that all works out, to Stephen's point, for a net benefit rather than a net detriment. And like, that's how technology works. And that there's never a world in which we can build technologies that don't have negative implications. And that seems completely pragmatic, right? That just seems like a description of how the world has worked. There's a part of me that wants to be like, well, yeah, does it have to work that way, right? We know now what the implications of information technologies are. We're not going to the podcaster's point, we're not going to pull away from that. We're not going to be like, oh, big data, we're just going to stop developing it or using it. Like it's there, it's part of the world. She called it the fourth industrial revolution, right? The idea that information technologies is what's reshaping the world. So maybe all we have to do is worry about regulation. And that makes me worry as an ethicist, like, what's my job? My job is to think about contemporary technologies and point to places where in the future they probably should be regulated, right? So think about the negative implications. But what I can't do as an ethicist is think proactively with my colleagues, say working in STEM disciplines or technology disciplines, and say, oh, you're working on this cool widget, right, that the world has never seen, you shouldn't. Maybe that's not the place of the ethicist.
You know, it's an old philosophical argument about balance. And I'm thinking of a previous discussion we had with the drone argument. I read that when one of our previous presidents had to determine when and how to use a drone, they would try to identify a terrorist, but maybe the terrorist was staying with a group of totally innocent people. And they used some type of calculation, like if they could get the terrorist, that they were pretty sure it was him, but it killed 6 other innocents, then they would go ahead and do it. If it was more than 6, then they wouldn't. And they used the calculation that if that terrorist was not killed, then he would probably kill many more than the 6. Even the court system, of course, isn't perfect either. There's a lot of innocent people that are in prison right now, as you probably have guessed too. So, it seems to me that's an old philosophical argument that's always going to come up in this kind of decision.
Yeah, it smells an awful lot like the Sorites problem, like the heap of sand argument. Like, how many innocents does it take to make a disaster versus
Exactly.
Yeah, and this is where, like, I typed in the chat while you were talking, Charles, the distinction between calculations and best judgment. Like, the argument seems to be, especially even from the podcast, seems to be, well, eventually our big data technologies, our AI technologies will be more efficient than we are, right? They'll be better at these, their calculations will be better than my judgment. And I worry that the world is like too complicated, because you think of, to your example, the drone, they might be able to identify 6 innocents versus 1 combatant, but who are those 6 innocents seem to matter a great deal, right? If it's 6.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I mean, and then it is an old philosophical argument, and it's this distinction between character and outcome, and like, it's all of the sort of normative ethics work that we do. Like, by what do we make ethical decisions? Is it just about numbers, calculations? Is it about character? Is it about duties and responsibilities? Is it about relationships? Right? It's a terrorist at his 6-year-old's birthday party, and like 8 other 6-year-olds are around, or is it anyway? Yeah.
Very good.
Yeah. Thank you all. This has been super fun. I'm really grateful for your time and thinking with me about these topics. We could do this for a lot longer, but I want to wrap us up and point us to what's happening in 2 weeks on the 30th. There, we're going to return to Michael Levin's talk, Synthetically Living Organisms, he gave for Ethically Speaking, where he talked about xenobots. Xenobots are these artificial life forms, basically. We're going to be talking about an update to his work, because as I mentioned at the beginning of the session this morning, a few weeks after he gave a talk for us, National News reported that his lab had discovered that their xenobots were procreating. which is the first time where artificial life has created artificial life, which is really interesting. So we're going to be talking about what I called baby xenobots and other potential horrors, because again, there's sort of a dark trend to this series, but you can listen to Ethically Speaking, to that podcast, and hear what Levin had to say at that time. You can read about what's going on in advance of that session, but we'll talk artificial life and xenobots on the 30th. And then I will mention that if anybody is doing ethics research or has topics that they've been thinking about, the last session this semester is open to you all to sort of talk through your work and your projects. So that's happening on April 27th.
Terrific topic. I look forward to it.
Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah, and I'll stick around if you've got any final thoughts, but I'll stop our recording and say see you next time.
Thank you.